So the first one will be, look, how do you see the state of democracy in contemporary society today? For example, I've just come back from the United States, and a number of my academic colleagues speak about the political situation over there with Donald Trump as the recently elected president, and it's obviously generated a lot of interest in the media. So I think this is a really good question to ask. So, Giannis.
Well, look, I think, while I don't think entirely that democracy's in crisis, as some commentators would suggest, I do think there are real issues with democracy, especially as it's practiced. The idea of liberal democracy, I think, is in serious trouble in some respects. I mean, I think the United States is an example of some of the difficulties. One of the difficulties being is that, in fact, what we have is oligarchy. And you think about how much money is spent on campaigns, presidential campaigns. In particular, Donald Trump used a reasonable amount of his own money in all of this, and some of the other people who were vying for the candidatures for president also needed to raise huge amounts of money, some of which was some of their own money, but in most cases not. You come to Australia, we similarly have some issues with the amount of money that now needs to be spent on campaigns. What that means, I think, in terms of democracy is that only a certain kind of elite are now able to participate fully in the processes of electing leaders. To be sure, everybody gets a vote, but if the way in which the elections are decided is through the amount of advertising that is able to be facilitated by the amount of money that's being spent, that says something. But the other side of the thing, of course, is the issue about people not being listened to anymore. I mean, one of the major problems, Brexit is an example there. Also, that people are now wondering, how did that happen? There is a malaise, I think, in terms of democracy and democratic process. And I have some, I guess, some reasons why I think that's occurring. Some of which I think have to do with the changing kinds of values in society, which are, despite preaching tolerance and individual autonomy and the like, what we're actually seeing is a kind of rise of intolerance and totalitarianism. That is, certain kinds of views are no longer able to be freely expressed in society. There is a sort of rise in which the idea that political views now have to conform to what some people might call political correctness. That there is despite the fact of relativism and a lack of interest in truth, in fact we're getting the rejection of truth, and that it seems to me is problematic. So I think the democracy, whilst it's not going to disappear, nevertheless the kind of democracy we have is not particularly strong, I would say.
So in terms of, and I know we spoke very briefly about it before, clearly Trump is a response to what's come before, and he's a product of the current culture in society, or climate, if you like, of America. So would you agree with me that it's obviously a balance or a recalibration to the right as a result of, if you like, maybe a swing to the left with, say, some kind of policies that were implemented in some of the political ideologies and so on from the Democratic Party and so on, from Obama's term and so on? So would you say that is a fair representation of Trump and obviously the current political climate, if we use the American example. You know, it's a swing or it's a recalibration to the right, and that there'll be some kind of balancing somewhere at some point, or is that probably too generous?
I think it's probably too generous. I actually think, going back to my comments about oligarchy, I think one of the problems is that the way in which, particularly in the States, it seems to me, is that, and here I'm not, I guess, I'm looking from without rather than from within, but looking from afar, it seems to me that the whole process in the whole democratic process in the States has been to some extent undermined by lobby groups that in fact representatives now are basically being in some way suborned by various vociferous groups.
Yeah.
And so they're responding to, it seems to me, those who have the loudest voices, and also and this is something that Hayek has pointed out, and someone who is an apostle of the right, I might add, has some interesting things to say in relation to democracy. In particular, the idea that in the processes we have today, because many of these representatives are beholden to particular interest groups who put them into power, they then, once they're in power, then have to respond and say, okay, so if you say the shopkeepers
Appease
union,
the donors.
you have to appease the donors. So, we, the mining industry, have given donations to your particular party and also to elect you. Well, we want something in return. Now, there may not be, it's not like here's a paper bag of money and therefore you now vote in a particular way, but it's not as crude as that. But when you think about the ways in which differing groups will pressure representatives, they become beholden to those representatives because that's how they get to be voted in. So that, I think, is one of the difficulties. And now, it's not quite so bad in Australia, but we do now beginning to have some of the same kind of thing where ex-politicians who know the way around Canberra will also lobby on the behalf of particular groups, and so you're getting a differing kind of understanding of what democracy is about. It's basically pressure groups and lobby groups that are influencing the directions in which legislation.
And you can wonder why Joe Blow in the street feels disillusioned and feels like he hasn't got a voice.
Well, he
How
has.
can you compete against that?
Well, you can't, and that's the problem. I mean, clearly, if you could develop your own little lobby group, well, yes, of course, you would then perhaps succeed in having your voice heard. But it seems to me it's very difficult for the ordinary person to be able to do that. And I think this is, and the other side of this, of course, is that politics has become professionalised. That now you don't get the range of occupations in Parliament anymore. I mean, Ben Chifley was a train driver. Now, you're never going to get a train driver as a Prime Minister again. Why? Because everybody now, it's a career. So you begin as an intern working as a lowly person in somebody's political office. You then rise up the ranks to be the person in charge of the office, for example, and so on. And so then, of course, you then, if you're the press person, well, then eventually maybe you too will stand for a seat at some particular election. So you basically have a very narrow number of professions now, which from which politicians are drawn. I mean, I would say lawyers are the largest.
Well, they're certainly overrepresented, that's for sure, in terms of the political class. Now, I'm just noticing the time, so let's move on.